going to have a presentation, the case for spoken translation. We will have two presenters, Mirko Plitt, a founder and CEO at Medulla Language Automation, former head of technology at Translators Without Borders, and prior to that, he was a senior manager of language technology at Autodesk, and AK Rahim, an independent research consultant focusing on language challenges in developing nations. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Jeannie. So yes, so the topic of this presentation is spoken translation, which is in itself like maybe is a somewhat surprising concept, and I'll explain why. I should maybe add one thing about my particular profile. Actually, I joined recently the World Health Organization as multilingualism expert, and the previous talk is actually extremely relevant to my work. So thank you very much, and I'm very glad that I managed to get into this session because it's extremely relevant for the work that we're doing at the World Health Organization at the time. Anyway, so the case for spoken translation. Can we move to the first slide? Thank you. So initially, I'd put a word in the middle of this yellow arrow on this slide. So when you go from a written text in one language to another, to the same text in a different language, that generally has the activity that allows to do that has a name, and I think most of us here will be familiar with it. And if we were in an audience, I would ask the question, but I think that's probably not necessary. So this is, of course, translation. Translation designates the activity of translating a written text from one language to another. Pretty obvious. Although we do work in an environment where there's a lot of confusing terminology around what we call our activities, you know, localization, globalization, internationalization, of course, translation, so on. We're not that disciplined ourselves with how we use language. For translation, it's relatively easy. If we move to the next slide. So for spoken language, when you do the same thing, you go from one language to the different language. Again, I would be tempted to ask the audience what this is called, but it's given this audience, again, probably quite straightforward. It's interpretation or interpreting. The fact is that many people outside our industry, even if they're relatively close to our industry, will call that translation as well. In a more generic sense, that's not wrong. But when you talk about the profession, it is misleading to call an interpreter a translator, yet it is very common. Anyway, so the spoken service, if you will, the service of translation for spoken language is called interpreting. So we have one way of going from written text in one language to written text in another language, and we have another, like, you know, predefined path to go from a spoken utterance in one language to a spoken utterance in another language, which is called interpreting. Very good. So that's how we've been operating in our industry, if you will, although from an industry perspective, they're quite separated activities, but still, that's how we've been operating for forever, really, since it started as an industry, which industry, interestingly, is not that old. If we move, can we move to the next slide, please? So if we juxtapose these two activities, that's, you know, we've got translation, interpretation at the top. Now, is there something missing? In theory, you could say, how about going from spoken text or spoken utterances to a written translation? You know, you could say, okay, that takes you know, some type of transcription or so, but not really. There's not really a big need for doing that in a different form. Where it becomes much more relevant is when we can we move to the next slide, please? When we go actually from written text to spoken to the spoken form in a different language. There is no predefined practice in our industry to do that, and it's actually much less incidental, if you will, or anecdotal, that there should be a path for that, because it's actually quite obvious if you think of literacy around the world, which is unevenly distributed across cultures, if you will, across countries, across regions, but also within populations, even within the same country or so. Literacy is not evenly distributed socially, but even within groups, can be a question of gender, can be a question of age, of social class, and so on. So there is actually, in our traditional way of approaching translation, interpreting, the assumption is that the ability to consume communication is evenly distributed. So if the creator of a piece of information decides that the best way of disseminating is written, the assumption is that the same holds for the receiver, and it's a very weak assumption that is very much based on how we've been doing translation in a business context. Until now, I would be tempted to say, within markets, mature markets, wealthy countries, where you had a similar level to education and distribution of literacy. Keeping in mind that literacy is not a given in rich countries either. In Switzerland, where I'm based, for instance, a number that I'm familiar with is that there's a level of illiteracy or functional illiteracy of 10%. So it's not like illiteracy is just a question of certain parts of poorer parts of the world. It's actually a phenomenon that is pretty much universal. And our industry doesn't really do much to address this. So why does this matter? Can we move to the next slide, please? Why does that actually matter? So I said it does matter more than transcription. Yes, transcription in a sense is interesting. For instance, in a video context, we just saw that in the context of e-learning, and if you use machine translation and you get your subtitles translated at the same time, it's actually quite convenient, because your way of consuming a video, watching a video, might actually be on your phone whilst you're supposed to be at work, and you do that under the table or so, and then it's nice if you can do that without putting the sound on. But that's more anecdotal. As I said, if we think about literacy, it's not a choice of the person who may need access to information, and written information tends to be, or say authoritative information tends to be provided rather in writing than in spoken form, typically around the world. In most cases, whenever information is critical, it will be in writing. Okay, I see the slides are not really visible. They're not essentially, I think, for the interest of this presentation, but I'll read out what it says. So why it matters? So beyond this kind of obvious example of literacy, it does matter even beyond that. So for your communication objectives, even say as a company, so beyond the humanitarian interest or so, you actually may be missing out on important parts of your audiences. So again, think of Switzerland. 10% of the population is not really able to read and write, let alone in the language that you assume that they speak. You actually may be missing out on your target population. If you're developing an app that is supposed to be used by many people, say a shopping app or so, and you're actually by design excluding 10% of your potential audience, and it might even be higher depending on what type of market you're addressing, you're actually maybe missing out if you just focus on writing. And of course, you may be missing out opportunities to reach your literate audiences too. I'll bring up a different example there. One is, of course, countries where, say, or situations where written information cannot be handed out easily, or where it's just actually very effective to use loudspeakers in a market square, for instance, or radio broadcast. If you just rely on writing to bring across information, you actually may be missing out again also on your literate audience. So that's under communication objectives that may be in just any business context, really. And then, of course, there's the social impact side. And in our industry, I think we generally care a lot about the importance of language to reach everyone who speaks the language. And what we do when we just rely on writing, when we just provide content or information in writing, we actually, without necessarily intending to, we actually create dependencies between societies, between social groups. For instance, I think I mentioned already the gender aspect of literacy distribution. So it's not uncommon in around the world, unfortunately, that women still have less access to education than men. So in order to access sometimes information that is specifically addressed to women, women will depend on men to access that information. And depending what type of information that is, that may actually be really problematic for instance, because men may not understand the information themselves. If it's about say female hygiene, or so, it might be taboo, or it might be something where men lack the terminology and won't be able to explain. So this type of information gets easily lost, or it reinforces dependencies. As I said, that women will then depend on men, or certain parts of the population will depend on certain types of elderlies who have privileged access to education. And where this way of communication doesn't work, you actually indirectly will support the spread of misinformation, which a couple of times I think the context of the pandemic has come up. And again, with me now working at World Health Organization, it's a topic that's extremely important, taken very seriously there, and a lot of action has been developed around fighting misinformation around the pandemic. If you just rely on written information, you open the door to people with less access to information to be vulnerable to misinformation and to spread it further, of course. So it's one of these hidden aspects of factors that actually contribute to misinformation, be it about vaccines or how the diseases spread, also, and in other areas, of course, as well. Access to information, because it's provided only in writing, is a hidden challenge there. Can we move to the next slide, please? So one example here I'm taking here is actually here taken from Switzerland. So this is from COVID-related information made available in, I think, about 30 languages in Switzerland. Just social distancing and these types of instructions. And so they've been translated into English, of course, and many other languages, including Arabic, as you can see here. But again, you have speakers of Arabic in Switzerland as well. Minorities, immigrants, and so on, who don't read and write. So again, they may not be able to actually receive this information. And it's not just a question of misinformation. It is also a question of them not being able then to follow the instructions, which may have an impact on our ability to fight a disease, spread of a disease. So it's pretty relevant. It's not just so this lack of an well-established practice to go from written information to spoken communication is a real challenge, is a real thing, if you will. And we can move to the next slide, because now we will see from AK how this is even much more relevant than I was able to allude to.
Thank you, Mirko, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm just quickly going to talk about the work I've done in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, and in Rakhine State, Myanmar, with the Rohingya population. Alex, if you can go to the next slide. Just very quickly, the Rohingya are one of the largest refugee groups in the world, if not the largest currently. I'm sure you've heard about them in the news this morning, perhaps. There was a massive fire in Cox's Bazar. Thousands of people are homeless now. But yeah, they fled Myanmar in 2017. There were several waves of them escaping to Bangladesh, but the most recent one and the largest one was in 2017. Alex, can we next slide, please? And the reason why we're discussing the Rohingya community, particularly with Mirko's presentation, is because the Rohingya community actually exemplifies many of the aspects that Mirko pointed out in terms of extremely low literacy. You also have a language, the Rohingya language, that is not standardized, and it's an oral language. There are written scripts, but there isn't a uniform agreed upon script. So in order to communicate with the Rohingya community, you actually rely on various other languages and scripts. So in the Rohingya refugee crisis, in the humanitarian context, you actually rely on Bangla, Burmese language, the Myanmar language, English, of course, and in terms of written scripts, you have Bangla, Burmese, Urdu, etc. So it's a very complex linguistic landscape in Cox's Bazar right now. Alex, next slide, please. And the other thing also is the Rohingya community and this crisis, it unfolded in an extremely, I would say, it's a digital desert. You have a huge variety and a rich, landscape of linguistic diversity, and yet in terms of digital presence, it's extremely low. You have, of course, Bangla, which is perhaps the most dominant language in eastern part of the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, and you also have Myanmar language. But both of these more popular languages, they're still very low in terms of digital literacy and digital access. So let alone these other various, smaller ethnic languages, Rohingya language being one of them. Next slide, please. And this slide just shows the, even more, not that, it's not complex enough, the how language flows in the camps. If you want to, if you're an international humanitarian, let's say from New York, and you would like to talk to the Rohingya community, there's very little chance that you can speak to them directly or communicate with them directly. One, thing that we as humanitarians do is we rely heavily on written communication. And as Mirka pointed out, that is what we call translation. But how do you translate from a language, English, to a language, the Rohingya language, that is not standardized and does not have a written form? What do you do then? Well, then you rely on this cascade of different languages and different basically profiles of language speakers. So as you can see, there's actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different languages being spoken here. And I kind of divided the registered Rohingya with the new Rohingya because there is a dialectal shift, a dialectal divergence going on between the older Rohingya and the newer Rohingya. So there's a very eclectic, let's say, convergence of languages here. And remember also the fact that some of these languages are not in the same language family. So it's interesting. Next slide, please. Now, there was the linguistic complexity. Now we're going to talk about the humanitarian language and the complexity within that. Many terms we use in the humanitarian community, they don't necessarily, they're very jargony, they're very, technical or academic, and you don't really hear them in colloquial English, let alone colloquial Bangla or Burmese or even Rohingya. Next slide. And this is very important because humanitarian language has to be life-saving information. And in order for it to be life-saving information, there has to be a two-way communication. We can't just be the one speaking to the, you know, the refugees or internally displaced community. We also need to hear their grievances, their complaints, their feedback. And of course, if you don't have a common language, which is usually the case, you know, in most humanitarian contexts, you don't have a common language because most of the humanitarian crises take place in lesser developed countries. We don't know if this communication is actually saving lives. Next slide. And you also, sorry, this isn't showing up, you know, clearly, but a lot of the words that we use in, as I mentioned, in the context, they're very jargon. You can't really translate them to begin with. Like, for example, woman-friendly space. That term is only used in the like in humanitarian contexts, like camps, etc. I doubt, you know, walking down the street of New York, I really won't have a place called woman friendly space, you know. But in the camps, that is an extremely important concept and an extremely important physical space. So how do we let the community know that this place exists? If you just say woman friendly space and then you translate it into Bangla, standard Bangla, most of the Rohingya people really won't understand either languages, and especially the woman, because Mirko alluded to this in his part. Even within a community, you have different forms of spoken language. We can call them sociolects. So basically, dialectal differences based on the social groups that you're in. And the Rohingya women are particularly extremely vulnerable. They do not have access to education, of course, but they also don't have access to the bazaar, or they're not allowed to leave their shelters most of the time. So they don't really adopt many terms that humanitarians are using. The men tend to, Rohingya men, because they have more access to the bazaars, the markets, the actual clinics and centers, but the women don't. So you can't really speak to them directly. And the men usually are the gatekeepers of this community, older men, elderly, respected men, quote unquote, and they may not want to convey some of these messages to the woman because it may be, countering their culture or just, diminishing their authority. So the woman, as I said, very vulnerable. And how do you then speak to them, communicate with them directly, especially related to things related to hygiene or safety, gender-based violence, things that are extremely sensitive and men don't want to talk about. And many times men don't even have the words to talk about because there's a divergence in terms of the woman and the men in vocabulary. So this, I painted a very dire scenario here, the challenges that we worked with in the Rohingya community, both linguistic and sociolinguistic. Many language challenges arise from social contexts, cultural contexts, and how do we bridge those different challenges? How do we, overcome the cultural, linguistic challenges? We've done quite a bit of work on that. I've worked through Translators Without Borders, IOM, and various other organizations to address these challenges. But I will now hand it over to Mirko, who will talk more about the technology aspect of some of our challenges and also how we try to overcome them. Thank you.
Thank you, AK. And yeah, if you could move to the next slide, please. So in our industry, I think technology is kind of the default answer, and maybe not only in our industry, but I think in our day and time. And I was tempted not to say technology, but AI, of course. And we already heard, had this excellent talk at the beginning of this session about voice assistants and the voice technology, and it's fantastic technology. So isn't that just the solution moving forward, in particular in terms of the voice aspect that I raised, which is only one of the aspects, of course, that AK touched on, but an important one. And so can't we just use speech generation, machine translation, speech generation? Well, we can't. Certainly not for Rohingya, and certainly not for the vast majority of languages spoken in the world today, because if I remember the number correctly from the first presentation today, even Google, which is leading the pack in terms of language support for speech technology, offers speech generation, I think, in 36 languages, plus a couple of, four locales of the same languages. That's of course not sufficient to address this. Where it's available, of course, it makes sense to use it, and we should, I think, in general, be more proactive in using speech generation to address it. But but on its own, for a long time being, it will not be a sufficient solution. Can we move to the next slide, and we slowly but surely come to the end? So originally, I was hoping we would be in a position today to present a concerted effort with a couple of organizations, of the non-profit organizations, to actually create basically technology that allows us to create, to manage a library of spoken translations. We're not quite there yet. We'll see whether that effort will take off. But there are already successful. There's a simple improvement that we all can try to make as we produce translations, which is simply to record those translations. Using simple voice recording widgets as part of your translation process, a bit like what LinkedIn developed, I think, last year at some point, where people can, LinkedIn members can now record the pronunciation of their names, which is extremely helpful in our global world, I find. And it's very simple, and you don't need AI for that. This is really, it's still technology, but it's pretty basic technology, and it's similar to the technology that was used successfully at Translators Without Borders in the Carter Speak system to translate, to record spoken translations with the help of volunteers. Forvo is another popular approach of recording, and basically aligning written and spoken text in any language. And there are quite a few other initiatives like that. It's pretty simple and focused solutions that are easy. So as a takeaway from this session, I just would want to invite everyone to think about where they can use, where you can use recorded translations, and maybe make them available just as MP3 files or whatever when you deliver, to audiences. I think it can be more helpful than or more impactful than many of us would suspect. And that's it for our presentation.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Such an important topic, more than ever. We only have a minute left before the end of your session, but hopefully we can squeeze in one quick question. The Rohingya situation is very interesting, but it is not an exception, rather. How do you ensure that a recorded translation match the written translation?
AK, do you want to talk about how exceptional the situation is very briefly?
It's exceptional in the sense that, we are working with a community that has various other, as I said, cultural and social restrictions as well, on top of the linguistic. So in that sense, the dire need of it is exceptional, but I totally agree. There are other languages that have similar challenges. And I guess, Mirko, if you want to speak to that, the tech aspect of it, or the, the speech, written to speech aspect of that.
Actually, the Rohingya aspect is an exception in the sense that it's probably less complicated than other refugee situations, as as hard to believe that is. But in other refugee situations, you often have a mix of populations who speak different languages. The equality aspect, it's interesting actually. And when we did that at Translators Without Borders, it was a challenge, but not so much in the sense that that you know there would be a disconnect between the translations and the recordings. That actually, you know, it's kind of an imagined issue. It isn't. That's not a problem. What the only thing that happens is that people get confused which languages they're supposed to be recording in. It's as simple as that. Someone needs to listen to it to just make sure essentially it's the right language, and that's it. Now for Rohingya, of course, there's an additional challenge that it's not even a written script. So, but we're not going to get into that right now. That's a topic on its own that AK could talk about hours about.
And I bet that would be a very interesting discussion. Unfortunately,